good morning, good evening. This is the Ian Dubé Show, the most comprehensive talk radio show on the internet. And today I have the pleasure of having Bill DiPrano, Masters athlete, and Hawthorne Wesley, member of the USATF Georgia Hall of Fame Committee. Gentlemen, good evening. How are you doing?
Good evening. I'm doing fine. Good evening.
All right. I'm really excited about getting you guys on this radio station because you guys are probably gatekeepers of a lot of great historic information in the city of Atlanta and the state of Georgia. And today we're going to talk about it, kind of share those great stories that you've amassed over the years. I know we all go way back to the 30s and all the way up to the current time where we have some of the greatest Olympians and greatest athletes in track and field history. So I'll start with Bill. Bill, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I was born and raised in Atlanta in the Grant Park section, actually. And I graduated from Tech High School. And I think the reason I went to Tech High, my cousin had gone to Boys High, and I don't know whether the folks out there listening know Boys High and Tech High, but Atlanta used to be segregated, the gender segregation. And we had Boys High, which was all boys, of course, and Tech High, which was all boys. And then in Grant Park, in what is now Roosevelt High School, used to be Girls High, all girls. We did have a school that was a co-ed school downtown, and that was commercial. And since they were downtown, they didn't have too much of a sports program, but Boys High and Tech High had great programs. And some of the great athletes come through Boys High and Tech High. One notable athlete, and I'm sure Hawthorne will agree with me, was Clint Castleberry.
I certainly remember him. I will say he's slightly before my time, but I've heard plenty about him.
Yes.
Great. Now, Hawthorne,
yes, go ahead.
Give us a little bit about your background.
I'm a little younger than Bill. As I say, Clint Castleberry was a big star at Tech when I was in the first grade, but I've heard about him. Clint Castleberry was lost in World War II. He's missing in the Mediterranean somewhere. I started North Fulton in 48 and finished in 53. Then I went to Auburn. Then I went in the U.S. Army, and I came back out, and that's when I got involved with the Atlanta Striders and with Buddy Folks. We ran that together for about 3 or 4 years. Buddy was finally sort of retired. They didn't have master's program back then, and he was about 36 or 37. He did run and win several major races when he was as old as 33, which was unheard of back then. And then the Atlanta Striders sort of merged with a group called the Metropolitan Atlanta Track Coaches Association, and that formed the Atlanta Track Club, and that, of course, the Atlanta Track Club still exists today. I ran for North Fulton, Auburn, and for the Atlanta Striders, and that's about my background.
Great. So let's go back to, the beginning. And Bill, obviously you're just a little bit more mature than Hawthorne is, so you've got a chance to see track at a different time. So let's talk about track back in the 30s. Is that correct? You were running in the 30s?
Well, I would. Let's see. I would say I was about 13. I was running. I know I won my second grade in parochial school. I won the second grade as a sprinter. It was at a picnic, and that kind of set me on fire. But what I'd really like to bring up, and Hawthorne here, is he's talking about the Atlanta Striders and Sammy White. Do you remember him, Hawthorne?
Yes, he ran for the Atlanta Striders. I know
Right.
Sammy fairly well. I'm sorry to say I haven't seen him in about 10 years.
Well, he's kind of dropped off. He doesn't run Masters anymore. But when I first started running in Masters, Sammy was he was actually our leader and he's a great athlete. And but anyway, I'd like to also tell the story that when they started the Atlanta Track Club, actually, we were talking about the Roswell Relay a while ago, and we had a scratch meeting one night, and Ed Newby and Paul Koshua, you'll know those names, I'm sure.
Definitely. I was a teammate of Ed Newby, but go ahead.
Yeah, and Jimmy Carnes.
Uh-huh.
And anyway, this Kasha was kind of the spokesman, so he gets up in front of the group there at the scratch meeting just before the I don't know if people know what a scratch meeting is, but usually the coaches gather and they decide on lanes and the order of events and that type of thing. But they got up and said, we're starting a new club, the Atlanta, and we're going to call it the Atlanta Track Club. And it was Striders was there, Sammy White, and I don't think Buddy Folks was at that meeting because he wasn't coaching.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I looked over at you might say my assistant coach, but he was helping with the track, and I said to him, I said, that will never fly. so, and the other one was Tim Singleton, and of course he put on that first race, and I think I think he had about 15, and everybody gave Tim $2 or $1 or something for the trophy. And they had the first Peachtree Road race. And that thing just took off after that first race.
People, you talk about not flying. Several people, I think, were a little skeptical when Tim came up with an idea of running down Peachtree on the 4th of July. He was also told that would never fly. But go ahead.
Thought you'd like that one since some of the Striders you're talking about.
Yeah. Never met Sammy White until 1963. I don't know when that year was. I met Sammy White for the first time in 1963.
So Sammy White was one of the founding fathers of the Atlanta Track Club. Is that what your guys are saying?
I don't remember Sammy there. Sammy ran with the Atlanta Striders.
Okay,
Sammy wasn't in those first formative meetings we had. Sammy was running for the Atlanta Striders, and I believe you talked about him coaching. Was he not coaching at Cedartown High School? Not Cedartown High School. Was he not coaching at a school in Cedartown? Sammy White, I think, at that time was coaching at an all-black school in Cedartown. Now, correct me if I'm wrong.
I can't correct you because I think he was coaching at the all-black school.
Yeah, I think it was in Cedartown. Sammy is a native. I'm trying to think of where he's from. Sammy went to Savannah. No, I believe Sammy is from Cedartown, and he went to Savannah State. Sammy was a quarterback for Savannah State. I know that.
Right.
Sammy played quarterback for Savannah State. And he had him affiliated with Cedartown in some fashion, shape, or form. I met Sammy in 1963, the first time they ever had an integrated track meet in the state of Georgia, the Georgia AAU, and that is quite a story. If you want to hear about that, I'll tell it later, but I met Sammy after that, and then he hooked up with the Atlanta Striders. At the time, he was basically a long jumper. I think that was Sammy's event. Now, I know he's done everything since then, including throw the discus and run the hurdles and probably high jump. But Sammy was a long jumper in college.
Yes.
And Sammy was a good long jumper. Sammy had competed. I know Sammy competed once in a meet against Ralph Boston because I was there. Now, he didn't beat Ralph Boston, but he competed against him, which is, I guess, something you can brag about.
Because did
Yes.
Sammy White come out in '59 at Savannah State? I'm looking here on the internet, and it looks like he was a '59 graduate of Savannah State University.
That sounds right.
Yeah,
That sounds right.
I would say that was right.
All
Sammy
right, let me
is-
tell you, you want track history, let me give you some. Back in those days, in Georgia, of course, the AAU wanted all integrated events, but the Georgia AAU wouldn't do it. The National AAU put pressure on the Georgia AAU, and so what the Georgia AAU did, they dropped the name AAU. This was in 1962, and they called the meet the Alexander Donnan meet. In those times, the race was run at Grant Field. Grant Field was free to the AAU. They charged $1 admission, and the meet drew well. They'd get about 2,000 or 3,000 fans at $1 apiece, which basically funded the AAU's program for the year. Most of the rest of the program was swimming, but they refused. In 1963, Buddy became chairman of the AAU in Georgia, chairman of the track, and he told everybody they would have to integrate. And Tech just sort of avoided the controversy by saying we couldn't have the meet there. So Sid Scarborough, who was athletic director of the Atlanta Public School System, he stuck his neck way out with nobody to back him up and said we could have it at Grady Stadium, and he was taking all the risk on himself. Nobody was going to help him. Well, we had the meet, and it worked out perfectly. It went off without a hitch. It was a big surprise. The University of Tennessee was exceedingly dominant down here then. They brought their team, and they brought the Knoxville Track Club, and usually those two teams together could run 1 and 2. But they got upset big time that night by Morehouse. And that was a real big deal because Morehouse had upset a national powerhouse that night. The only person I remember on that Morehouse team was the 2-miler named Walker, and I can't even think of his first name. But they had runners in every event, and that was a big deal. The next year, now that crisis was over without anything happening, we were going to bring Bob Hayes. Now, Bob Hayes at the time everybody knew he was going to win the Olympics, which he did. He won the Olympics in 3 events. And Bob was a big name then, and in those days, track had more interest in the public than it does now. So, and we thought Florida A&M was kind of holding us up. They wanted $500 worth of expenses to bring their entire team here. Today, if you'd got a runner of his caliber, it cost probably $100,000. But all they wanted was $500, so we asked the AAU to back us up. And the AAU said they wouldn't give a penny. So we got a few people to sign, more or less pledge the money if we lost money, and brought Bob Hayes here. Bob Hayes and the team came, and it worked out perfectly. And we got Grady Stadium for $300. We had a few more expenses, but we got about 6,000 or 7,000 people and charged them $1 apiece. That money was turned over to the AAU. So then Buddy Folks asked the AAU for some of it back to help have summertime track meets. And the AAU told us that they had spent all the money on track they were going to this year, and the money wasn't ours. They're going to spend it on swimming meets. So Buddy Folks got mad and walked out.
It looks like we lost Bill DePrano, so bear with us, folks. We're going to bridge him back on here, and I know Hawthorne is talking away.
Tennessee's best hurdler, and he ran about a 13.5 or 6, which at the time was a national high school record. Now that's another big thing that happened here at the Georgia. I forget what they called it then. It was no longer AAU. And I think it was the Atlanta Track Club Invitational or something. But he ran about 13.6 and set the national record.
Yeah, I think it was still the AAU. I was in that.
No, the AAU wouldn't endorse us. And, no, we would not merge with them if we put the name AAU on there, they got all the money.
I think we might be talking about different years then, because Ian, I showed him a picture of me and AAU. Buddy Folks won the race with a 9.5.
Yeah, that was either 1960 or 62, because both those years he won and ran a 9.5.
Hey, let me ask you this, guys. Let me ask you this. Let's step back, because you guys are talking like we were there. Some of us weren't there. I wasn't even born then. So let's step back.
Well,
how was track and field organized? You know, now we've got the Georgia High School Association, we got NCAA, we got NAIA, we've got USA Track and Field, we've got AAU, the remnants of AAU.
Well, now let me redline one of them. USA Track and Field didn't exist then.
Right, exactly.
It was, four things. You had the various state high school associations. You had the NCAA. You also did have the NAIA, which had a lot more schools in it then than it does now. And then after college, it was the AAU, and they controlled everything. I mean, you had to have AAU sanction to do anything, and they were really dominant. I mean, they ran it with an iron hand, and there wasn't much you could do about it. I want to praise Jimmy Carter. I think he put the final death knell to the AAU when he passed the Athletes' Bill of Rights. At the time, I didn't like it, but now I realize that's one really great thing you have to give Jimmy Carter credit for. He passed the Athletes' Bill of Rights, and that made athletes free people entirely. But when the AAU, there was a rival organization that started. It was called, I want to say, it was USTAF, U.S. Track and Field, USTAFF. They were mostly made up of college coaches who opposed the AAU. The NCAA and the colleges and the AAU were constantly at odds with each other. But the fact is, the AAU had the power to redline any athlete they didn't like from international competition. And you eventually had to knuckle into the AAU, or they wouldn't let you run in the Olympics. And they were very dictatorial about it. For instance, Wes Santee qualified for the AAU, for the Olympics in around 1962, and the AAU decided he qualified in the 1,500 meter. The AAU just made the arbitrary decision that he shouldn't run the 1,500, and they made him run the 5,000, and he didn't do well. I mean, that's the way it was back then. They would tell you stuff like that. And it was, well, I'll give you another example. This international organization, they had a rule that you couldn't go to international competition without a chaperone. And the chaperone was there for the purpose of making sure that no professional talked to you. They said they were protecting you from professionalism. But, of course, like everything else, just like the prohibition, you got plenty of whiskey. Just like protecting you from professionalism, in some of these sports like basketball and boxing, a lot of these professionals just came in and boxed and played basketball anyway, despite the fact the AAU claimed they were protecting us from professionalism. But if you left the state of Georgia, you had to get a travel permit. I've had to get many a travel permit. It wasn't that bad. It was just paperwork. You had to go over to a lady over there near Emory named Miss Blitch, and she'd give you the travel permit. You take it to where you ran with all the names on it. You'd get the chairman of the meet there to sign your travel permit for you. Then you'd bring it back and give to her. You had the list on there what everybody ran and what they got in the way of prizes, and you had to list what money you got, expense money, if any, on there, and then you turn it in. Now, we had to do that every time we left the state of Georgia. Now, that's the way it was then. Now, and that goes in, I don't know, as long as I was competing, which went through 1965, we had to do that. But as I say, it was not that hard. It was just a pain. Now, you were limited to the number of days a year you could compete out of your state. There was no limit to competing in your state, but you're limited to so many days a year. but it wasn't that bad. It's only like 15 or 20 days, which we couldn't have possibly run 15 or 20 times out of the state.
So
now that's the way it was back then. The youth staff finally died, and then they got another group. I believe it was the Athletes Congress, and now today it's USA Track and Field. I think youth staff was probably the great-grandfather of USA Track and Field.
So back then, so now here's the infancy of USA Track and Field. Now, going back, now you talked to several, you made key points in regards to the restrictiveness of AAU and they controlling basically the athlete, and they had no right. So in other words, if the meet wasn't sanctioned or they didn't like it or they didn't want to, or you hit the max number of meets per year, you were prohibited in competing. Is that what I'm understanding?
That's exactly right. And see, they laid down the law. When youth staff started having meets, they told everybody that if we ever competed in a youth staff meet, we would be ineligible for ever running anything sanctioned by the AAU. Now, a lot of that wasn't that bad unless you had ambitions for the Olympics. If you had ambitions for the Olympics or any other national team, you couldn't do it. Now, a lot of this, of course, the records and all weren't kept that tight. And so sometimes we did go to these youth staff meets. And of course, we were taking a chance with our eligibility, but frankly, the lady, Mrs. Blitch, never knew about it. I mean, we didn't tell her we had run there. If we told her we'd run there, she'd probably have us blacklisted. But it never happened. But for the more important athletes, and obviously I was not one of them, but if you got good enough to be a national class athlete, you did have to watch your step.
Now, how did they enforce those rules? In other words, if I went out of state,
if they found out that you had taken any money, you were permanently banned. Or if you had gone to an unsanctioned meet, you could be permanently banned. But not much of that happened because they really didn't have that much of a power structure to enforce everything. Although some people did get in trouble, the most notable of which was our greatest miler at that time, the one I just mentioned, Wes Santee, who got banned for competition right about the time they broke the 4-minute mile. He was a candidate for breaking a 4-minute mile, and right about that time, the AAU banned him from competition, and he never ran again. He had been taken, I think he got a little more than he should have. You could get certain prizes. You could get a watch, for instance, that it didn't cost over a certain amount. The retail value wasn't over a certain amount. You could get nice-looking trophies, but if you got anything that could construe to be something that you could hawk for a lot of money, they wouldn't allow it.
Wow! So things
we gave the Atlanta Track Club was giving nice watches. We got it from a guy downtown named Bernie Merritt, who had a little watch business. We got them from him cheap, and were given nice watches. And we were told by one athlete, a Tennessee athlete, he liked to come to Atlanta and compete because our watches, he could hawk them for more than anybody else's. That's another thing. In the AAU rules, if you had ever sold or pawned an athletic trophy, you were a professional. And here's another stickler. If you were a coach, a high school coach, you were a professional. And if you were a lifeguard, you were a professional. Any type of coach for money, you were a professional. And you couldn't compete.
So, okay.
But they had an AAU tournament here in basketball every year. My cousin played. He was coaching. And he said everybody in the whole tournament just about was a high school coach. And just about every one of them were not supposed to be there. And then one time they let a former Tech star who had played in it was the American Basketball Association, it's sort of a rival of the NBA that never lasted. But he played in the ABA, and then he quit and came back here and was coaching. His name was Roger Kaiser. But he was playing in the AAU tournament, and they had a big article in the paper about it. And the AAU finally realized that 4/5 of the people in that tournament were professional, but I don't think they ever really did anything about it. They were fighting something. They were fighting something they couldn't stop.
So,
as you know now, track athletes can be as professional as football or baseball players. But in those days, if you did one little thing like that, they could ban you for life or suspend you.
So Roger Kaiser, who went on to be the Life University's basketball coach,
Life University, right,
and played at Georgia Tech. Is that correct?
He played pro basketball at one time.
And didn't he play college basketball at Georgia Tech?
I don't think so. He coached at West Georgia.
Okay, so he coached at West Georgia.
He won an NAIA championship at Life.
Okay, so now, Bill, going back to you. Here it is.
Well,
it's now we're in the 30s and 40s.
Let me say this. When I ran the AAU, we're talking about two different worlds. I ran in 1949. And I think Hawthorne's, he's way up to 54. He's talking about West Santee. So I don't know. They must have changed the rules. I don't remember all those being that stringent. I know that Avery Brundage, who controlled athletics at that time in this country, had a lot of those amateur rules, but I never had to worry about that. I just left that up to Coach Speg Towns.
Now, Bill.
Well, you didn't have to worry because there wasn't much money back then.
Right.
Yeah, well,
I mean, nobody was hardly paying anybody around here anything.
Now, Bill,
Speaking of Avery Brundage, so Ian will know Avery Brundage was the one who cast the vote in favor of having the Olympics in Germany in 1936. And he still took a lot of criticism for that till the day he died.
Right, and
well, he wasn't that good a man either.
No, I read a book, Rome, 1960 Olympics, and one of the things that they brought up about Avery Brundage was, one, he wasn't a good man because he had a child out of wedlock that he didn't support. He was anti-Semitic, and there was some other, and he really ruled athletics with the iron fist.
Right.
I had a
you
conversation.
Got that right.
I had a conversation with Hayes Jones at one time, and we all know who Hayes Jones is. And one of the things that Hayes Jones brought out was that he was a teacher. He went to Eastern Michigan University. He, got an education degree. He started coaching, and Avery Brundage called him, and because he was a track and field athlete, and said, "Hey, listen, you can't do that." So we knew that there was a lot of, that strong-handed control of the athletes back in the, from the Olympic Games all the way to Avery Brundage, which I think he left in the 70s. So
that's correct.
And, it was definitely a different world back then. Now, Bill, let's step back and let's go back to your days at University of Georgia. And, we talked about, at the time, we thought Spec Towns was one of the first coaches at Georgia, but, you talked about Weems Baskin. So let's talk about those days.
Well, Weems Baskin was Coach Towns' coach, and he moved on up to South Carolina from Georgia. I don't know whether he had problems at Georgia or not, but I thought he did a great job at Georgia. But then Coach Towns, of course, took the job, and he lasted a pretty good while. And then I think Louis Gainey might have been the next coach there.
That's correct.
I Hawthorne can correct me on that.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Weems Baskin, for the record, is an old Auburn football player, but go ahead.
Yeah, I knew he was from Auburn, but
he played football at Auburn.
Yeah, at the time I was at Georgia, Spec Towns was coaching at Georgia, of course, And then Weems Baskin was at South Carolina, and Wilbur Hutzel.
Was at Auburn, yeah.
Was he your coach?
Yes. He
Yeah.
was my coach, and Coach Rosen was an assistant coach.
Yes. Okay. All right. And I thought we might talk a little bit about high school athletics. I was going.
And we can go back to the high school athletics. So back then, how many high schools, when you were in high school, Bill, how many high schools were in the city of Atlanta? You talked about Boys High, you talk about Tech High, but what were the other schools out there?
Well, you're talking about Atlanta, that's it. Atlanta city limits were expanded in 1952. Before that, they had 2 white high schools. They had Washington, they had Howard, and they had Carver Vocational. They had 2, counting commercial high school, they had 3 high schools and for white and 3 high schools for black. The oldest school in Atlanta, and it was built in around 1892, is Washington High School. That's still the same building. It's on the National Historical Registry, and it's really a nice-looking building. Then they had Carver, and they had, and after that they started adding schools. But when Bill was in school, Atlanta city limits stopped right exactly where Brookwood Station is today. Buckhead was an unincorporated area.
But Hawthorne, you're leaving out. I hate to correct you on that. You're leaving out 2 schools. You're leaving out commercial.
Commercial, yeah, right. But I mean schools with athletic programs.
You're leaving out Girls High.
Yeah, but they didn't have an athletic program either, did they?
Oh, no. It was commercial, had a lame one.
Right. But actually schools that would been running track, those were your schools. We knew very little what was happening on the west side of town, except we occasionally would read about somebody in the newspaper.
Yeah.
We read about several people. There was one called Rocket 88 Mosley, who got drafted by the Chicago Bears. I forget what happened to him. Then there was another great athlete out there named Hamilton Holmes. And if you go west on I-20, you'll see Hamilton Holmes Drive. That's named after him. And Hamilton Holmes was quite an athlete. I read a lot in the paper about him. But we didn't know what was happening on the other side of town. There's another guy named Bivens that supposedly ran much faster times than anybody on our side of town was, and he played, I think he played for one of the Chicago teams. They had the Chicago Cardinals back then. He played in the NFL, but you never heard of these guys until they went to the NFL.
So,
unfortunately, they do such a sorry job of publicizing the Atlanta schools. I never heard of Richard Dent till he was playing for the Bears, and yet he played at Murphy.
Now, Hawthorne, obviously there was, before desegregation, and which is probably a dark time in all of our histories of, Atlanta and the United States, where did the African American, because we had separate state champions, is that correct?
Well, they had 2 different associations. I forget what the Black Association was. You're absolutely correct. You had 2 state champions. That ended in 66 or 67. One of those 2 years, they eliminated. The National Federation has a rule against. They won't recognize more than 1 association per state. So when they announced that they wouldn't recognize but 1 association, they closed the Black Association, and everybody integrated, every school. They had integration in Georgia athletics before that, but what it was, they were blacks that were attending formerly all-white schools. Now, we had a lot of blacks here in Atlanta playing, but they were playing from what would have been called an all-white school. That's another thing, Sid Scarborough. Sid Scarborough is dead, and he'll probably never get the recognition that he deserved, but he did something unthinkable back then, and again stuck his neck out. When they had 2 separate associations, 2 separate sets of high schools, he had an integrated Atlanta championship with all the schools black and white there. And he really took a risk doing that because nobody would back him up, but it went over well. And the thing about it, and this was a surprise to everybody, they thought, well, they'll get the sprints, but we'll win the distance events, we'll win the pole vault and all that. You know something? The 16 events in a track meet, the white schools won 2 of them, and that wasn't even the pole vault. The black schools won the pole vault. I think the white schools may have won the mile and one other event. The black won the 2 mile. They swept the white schools completely. And everybody was surprised because I say that the whites thought they'd win the events like the pole vault and the half mile, a mile, 2 mile, but it didn't work out that way. And there was a real good guy, I don't think you remember him. His name was Anthony Gates for Washington High. Back then, the state record in Georgia in the 400-meter was in the 48s. He ran in the 47s, and nobody could believe it. He went to Southern Illinois. I remember him. He went to Washington High. He was the star of the meet. But Sid Scarborough did that in 1965.
So he
got by with it, and I mean, his whole future was on the line. If anything had happened, they'd come down on him and run him off. But there was no incident at all. Sid Scarborough ran a good athletic program. They didn't tolerate anything out of the way of one of his meets.
Let me get in here for a minute. I happened to be coaching when all that happened that you're talking about. Sid started with a B-team program. They introduced the African-American kids to the B-team, and what they were going to do is I don't know whether it was 1 or 2 or 3 years, but anyway, they started with a B-team program. That's the way he broke that in. And another thing, you're leaving out the NGIC. I may be way before your time, though, on that, but that was when all the big schools were in the GIAA.
That's correct. Yeah, you're right. GIAA.
And then, but they also had the NGIC, and
North Georgia Intercollegiate Athletic, Interscholastic Athletic. Yeah, you're right. I remember those.
And those were the smaller schools. Actually, all the country schools were in the NGIC. So I want to get that in.
So you had the city schools. Now, how was the competition, the track and field competition? You know, we've got Atlanta, and Atlanta's obviously the state capital. But what about the competition coming out of Columbus, Albany, Savannah, Macon, you know, all the other next larger cities? How did that look? How was that competition?